Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Also out and about this morning was UKIP's leader, Nigel Farage. Yesterday, he branded the renegotiation deal a cam sham. And speaking to Andrew Marr today, he said the concessions the Prime Minister has brought back from Brussels on migrant benefits won't make any difference.
The issue is not migrant benefits. The issue is an open door to 500 million people and net migration running at 1/3 of a million people a year. And this under a Prime Minister who promised us he'd reduce migration to tens of thousands a year. The issue is the fact we're paying over £50 million a day in a membership fee, and nothing's been done to change that. And the biggest issue of all is our Parliament and our courts cannot strike down European law that's against our interests. They're the issues that people will make their big decisions on in this referendum, not the marginal issue of migrant benefits.
And we're joined now from Kendal by the Liberal Democrat leader Tim Farron, and with me here in the studio is the Environment Minister George Eustice. Welcome to both of you. George Eustice, first of all, at what point did you decide that David Cameron's deal wasn't going to be enough for you to vote to remain in the EU?
Well, look, I've been a supporter of renegotiation for around 15 years, but the reality is I wanted to see something a bit more fundamental. I would have liked to have seen the powers, for instance, of the European Court curtailed, maybe see us come out of some of the European directives which are unnecessary, where we could control things better nationally, see some of the budgets on things like structural funds repatriated. So really quite early on, I would say. I mean, I've obviously kept a clear position, but I'd hoped that it might have been possible to negotiate something more fundamental. In the event, that turned out not to be the case. So
right, you're disappointed with the Prime Minister. He didn't really live up to the billing of fundamental change in our relationship with the EU.
Look, he's tried his best, but the reality is the types of changes I wanted to see, those more fundamental changes, taking back control of budgets, curtailing the power of the ECJ, diplomats said that those were not negotiable. And to be frank, if you look at the fuss we've had just to get the very modest things that the Prime Minister asked for, they're probably right. So I've had to conclude quite reluctantly, really, that the way to get the kind of change I want to see is to replace our membership of the EU with a new UK-EU partnership.
Tim Farron, shivering there, I think, down the end. What do you think of the deal that David Cameron has secured?
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, I think George Eustice is, I guess, concentrating on some of the very detailed points that he disagrees with. I felt that the renegotiation was good. I think, in particular, Britain being in a position where it retains full membership of the single market, whilst not ever being forced to even consider joining the euro. That's the right kind of thing. But to be honest with you, what George is talking about, with all due respect, and indeed the renegotiation, is pretty, a side issue compared to the big, loftier issues that most people will be making their mind up over. Is it going to be in Britain's interest or not to be part of and in the driving seat of the world's largest, most prosperous market in most insecure and dangerous times that we're in now? Is it better for us to be alongside our friends and neighbours or to be isolated? And when you're dealing with huge global issues like climate change and the refugee crisis, are you better off on your own or working with others?
Well, and that's the point the Prime Minister made.
Exactly,
I mean, he says that we're going to be safer, it's going to be less risky, we're going to be better off staying in the EU. You're going for danger.
I don't agree with those people in the EU campaign who make this point. When it comes to security, look, we have to work with countries around the world on counter-terrorism. The United States, we have to work with countries like Turkey at the moment. Our special forces often deploy alongside Australians and New Zealanders. None of these countries are in the European Union. Of course, we also need to work with the EU countries, but we can work with them and cooperate very closely through a new UK-EU partnership. We don't have to give control of our laws away. We don't have to accept diktats from foreign courts.
Right, what do you say to that, Tim Farron?
Well, first of all, George has quite rightly pointed out we work with lots of other countries in other organisations like the UN, like the World Trade Organisation. So this issue about sovereignty and independence, we, all of us, with the possible exception of North Korea, pool our sovereignty one way or another by working with one another. Now, within the EU, could we work with them? Would it be a complete Dark Ages step if we left the European Union? Well, probably not. But just think how those other 27 countries, our nearest, closest friends and neighbours, would think of the United Kingdom if we chose to turn our backs on gentlemen, just don't forget that there are 11, I think, of the 28 countries in the European Union were behind the Iron Curtain just a generation ago. And these are people who, most of them in the Warsaw Pact, many of them had nuclear weapons on their soil pointed at this country. And today, we work together as friends and neighbours, cooperating.
But on
now,
that
you
point,
put that at risk, at your peril.
On that point, the RAF, for instance, has deployed planes to the Baltic countries like Estonia, under NATO, and we would continue to do things like that even if we're outside the European Union.
So is that a threat to our sovereignty? Is being in NATO a threat to our sovereignty?
No, it isn't a threat to our sovereignty, but it's a question of balance. And I think
But
when
why
it comes to the European Union, we have them dictating laws in thousands and thousands of areas where we don't need them to be dictating those laws, where we could do far better if we were able to think creatively about doing things differently and coming up with better policy.
Let's move on to the subject of migration. I mean, you
very creative to spend the next...
Hang on, sorry, Tim. We'll move on to migration because we're slightly short of time. You once stood for UKIP, George Eustice, in the European elections. Do you agree with Nigel Farage that without leaving the EU, there is the potential for 500 million people, as he quotes, to come to Great Britain?
Look, I don't sign up to Nigel Farage's brand of politics. I don't agree with him on many things.
But you agree with him on that?
No, to be frank, I don't feel as strongly on the issue of immigration as many others on the Leave side of the campaign. I still think that if we were to leave the European Union, we'd want to put in place quite generous provisions to allow people to come here on work permits. But there'd be a crucial difference. We would ultimately have control. So yes, we would have very generous provisions to allow free movement of people. But in the final analysis, if there was a problem, we would have control. We'd be able to change things. At the moment, we can't change things because we've given up control.
Right, and isn't that true, Tim Farron, that actually without controlling UK's borders, we cannot control the levels of migration, which some people find very, very difficult to deal with?
Well, we're not in the Schengen Agreement, therefore we have very large degree control of over our borders. And, George is right, actually, to say that freedom of movement is incredibly important. At this moment, the last time I checked, there are 2.3 million EU citizens living and working in the United Kingdom and 2.2 million British citizens working elsewhere in the rest of the European Union. So it is give and take. And what we need to understand is that is enormously beneficial to the United Kingdom. And we often talk about, or we hear from UKIP and others saying that we have a net contribution of £9 billion a year to the EU. They never mention there's an £80 billion a year benefit to the United Kingdom of being in the EU because of the single market and because of the freedom of movement of labour. And that's why it's so utterly bizarre that you've got Boris Johnson, currently the Mayor of London, the part of the UK that probably benefits most of all from being in the EU, adopting more positions than the Kama Sutra,
putting in place
whether we stay in the European Union or not.
I think that putting in place a free trade agreement, actually, as part of a new UK-EU partnership is the easy bit. Sometimes people compare it with what's going on with the EU-Japan at the moment and the negotiations with the US. The difficulty in those negotiations, I've been part of some of them, are resolving things like different technical aspects, welfare concerns on animals, all those sorts of things. Given that we've been in the European Union, the easy thing to do is to roll forward something rather akin to what we've already got in the single market. It'll be in everyone's interest. The European Union themselves, those countries, they've got a £60 billion trade surplus with the UK, and they would need to continue to trade with us. And it would be very easy, I think, to put in place a free trade deal with the rest of the European Union.
All of that, I think that is fantasy. It really is. We've seen how difficult it is to stitch up this arrangement in the European Union and North America at the moment. I mean, they thought that we will, having turned our back on Europe, find it easy to renegotiate any settlement.
The reason there's difficulty with the US is
any settlement with the rest of the European Union. That if you think about it, this renegotiation, which I think both of us accept was pretty minor, it took all that time and effort to get that little renegotiation.
Right.
Just imagine how difficult it will be to put together a trade agreement.
Just on that point,
if we do get that,
on that point,
just let George respond.
I agree with him. So it's been very difficult to get this minor negotiation. That is why we actually have to get a mandate from the people to leave the European Union, then we can negotiate properly.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much.